was thinking about my talk today, and I realized that I've sort of have three strands in my life related to these issues of addiction and recovery. One is as a person in recovery from a couple of different substance abuse disorders. Another is as a former scholar of the history and culture around recovery narrative, what I've studied with Susan. And then the third is in the last 5 years as the speechwriter for Mayor Walsh of Boston, who has a powerful recovery story that he shares and is a leader on these issues in municipal policy and a real voice for the on the issue. And I realized that my approach to this, I was actually sort of on the fly kind of synthesizing these three different strands of my life that I haven't really gone that far in synthesizing, or not as far as you might think. So if I seem like I'm speaking in different registers at different times, then forgive me. But I'll start with a conundrum facing speechwriters. That is that among the most powerful things anyone can do in a speech is to tell a personal story, especially if it involves suffering and struggle and change, like a recovery story. And Mayor Walsh shares his recovery story to great effect, notably, when he has a big stage like the Democratic National Convention. That's what he focused on, to try to use that stage to reduce stigma and bring hope to people. But it can be a challenge as a speechwriter to help provide words for a story that's so personal. So, even though I'm in recovery myself, I have a feel for the emotional beats. Everyone's story is unique. And so the upshot is that some of my best work consists of just a set of brackets that say, talk about your story. And in fact, Mayor Walsh knows from instinct and experience that authenticity is everything, and you have to sort of speak from the heart. And that's true of anyone. But something actually remarkable does happen when people share their story in a very personal way in a public setting. The formal distance created by the podium and the chairs and the staff and the cameras, in some cases, sort of collapses. And you can feel a change in the atmosphere, sort of a closer and more personal space than we're used to experiencing in official discourse. You can almost feel the stigma falling away sometimes, whether it's around your own disorder, that of a loved one, or even a distant memory of a parent or a grandparent who suffered long ago and in different times, or shaped your childhood in some way. But it's also a space that feels rich with possibilities for new kinds of connection, for healing division and fragmentation, the things that some believe are actually at the root of the opioid crisis and addiction in general. But more broadly, it feels like the kind of space where transformative meanings get made. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how I think they get made and sort of the collaborative way that those meanings get made around recovery in particular. I'm going to touch on a couple of aspects in the history of recovery storytelling that suggest how it changes people, how it changes society, and how it might help us deal with and think about the opioid crisis today. It's well established that storytelling has a positive effect in recovery from substance use disorders. Human beings understand ourselves through narrative structures that link past, present, and future, but addiction breaks down one's sense of living in a linear story and replaces it with an endless cycle of repetition and loss. And this view is backed by neuroscience that increasingly says addiction is a disease less of pleasure and reward circuitry, as we used to say, and more one of learning and memory systems. And that makes it also a pathology of self-narrative, of telling your life story and thinking your life story. So learning to speak your life as a recovery story is a way of restructuring your memory, all your associations, and your sense of a future. It's sort of a really remarkable way that people can actually almost rewire their brain, and there is evidence that backs up that is actually what happens over time through sharing narrative. And it's also widely accepted that public testimony, whether on stages or in books, and Michael touched on this, reduces stigma, increases understanding, invites compassion, and ultimately helps produce social and political reform. So recovery stories don't just change individuals, they end up changing society. So you have narrative in private recovery and narrative on the public stage, and they're very similar, and the stories will be similar, but they're also distinct due to the different settings and the different functions that they're playing in those different settings. And it's often the relationship between them, between these two functions of recovery narrative, the way especially that private stories move into public settings, that historically has shaped how we understand addiction and what we do about addiction as a society. Despite centuries of writing on opium and heroin and drugs, I think we're at a point with the current opioid crisis where that relationship is only just beginning to take shape. It's not as if we've never heard opioid-related stories or narratives before, but with this particular crisis, I don't think we don't have a clear collective sense of what kind of experiences are happening around either the disorder itself or recovery from it. But my focus today is less on the speaker of the recovery narrative and more on the role of the public audience in receiving that narrative. Those of us who don't suffer, especially from opioid use disorder, but who want to listen and learn and be supportive. And that covers a lot of ground. When I say public audience, that includes all the people who answer the surveys that Michael cited, the medical students that Raphael has talked to, anyone simply listening to the experience of a family member or an extended family member or someone in their neighborhood. And at this point in society, it really should be all of us, and that's going to be part of my point. We all should be sort of active listeners to the people actually experiencing this disorder. I believe we have as much work to do in learning how to receive a recovery story or a substance use disorder story as people in recovery do in learning how to share it. And I don't think we've paid enough attention to that role in the past, and people have sometimes suffered for it, and I'll touch on a couple of examples. Recovery meetings and recovery memoirs are older than many people think. They first really emerged in a big way in America in the middle of the 19th century. And since then, they have appeared and disappeared and reappeared in several guises. And here's how it's tended to work. The narrative develops in recovery movements. People dealing with substance disorders tend to find each other, support each other, in ways that, for whatever reason, the institutions and the society around them have not been willing or able to do. And when they find each other and support each other, they identify shared patterns in their experience. And that seems like an inevitable, a natural process. But in sharing these experiences and identifying with each other, they develop together narrative forms at particular points in history. And they're forms that other people can then adapt, it's like a template, to help describe their own experiences and launch their own recoveries. And it's a fascinating social phenomenon, and one I think is perhaps understudied, unless there's research I'm not aware of. You're telling an intensely personal and unique and individual truth, but you learn how to do it by listening to others tell theirs. So it's both imitative and yet intensely original at the same time. It's also a beautiful thing sort of socially, because if addiction is a disease of isolation, this process of collective narrative production through listening and sharing is a means by which people stitch themselves back into a caring community, even if it is just that community of mutual support, and they overcome that isolation. And that's, I think, one of the reasons for the power and the allure of recovery narrative as sort of a cultural phenomenon is that it's rooted in, it doesn't always describe the social aspect, it often ends up getting told in a very individual way, but it's rooted in a reconstruction of social relations from the ground up, from everybody's bottom. And we know that you can never actually get completely beneath your social identity, but in sort of broadly social terms, to compare to all the social assumptions that we walk around with every day, people sort of building back up from their bottom are really sort of establishing some fundamental social relations anew and trying to do it in a way that avoids all the mistakes, society's mistakes more than their own, that sort of got them there in the first place. It's almost like reinventing community from the ground up. And that's a very idealized picture, but I think there's reality to it. However, when recovery stories in recovery movements spread widely enough and they catch the public's imagination and they enter the public realm, they begin to have the kind of influence we'd like them to have, raising public awareness. At that point, society tends to embrace them for reasons that go beyond recovery, and that's inevitable. Stories perform what one theory in the humanities calls cultural work. As a society, we use stories to explore questions or resolve contradictions that are troubling us. And I'll share one example from history. The rescue mission movement thrived between the 1870s and around 1910, and it was sparked by evangelical Protestant missionary work in urban slums. The kind, I think we're somewhat familiar with these scenes from sort of 19th century American cities. But it was, these particular kinds of missions were effectively taken over by recovering alcoholics, the original sort of targets of this missionary evangelical work. And these people with alcohol use disorder focus their religious awakening on the challenges of getting sober and staying sober. And a key figure in this history was a man named Jerry Macaulay. He was an Irish immigrant in New York. He grew up largely on the streets and became a pirate on the East River, very sort of dramatic life. And he was a self-described drunkard. He got locked up in Sing Sing prison in upstate New York, and he had a conversion experience there. So after being freed, he eventually, back in his old neighborhood, bought the tavern where he used to drink and turned it into a mission. At this mission, he offered food and shelter and social support. It was called the Helping Hand for Men. And he conducted a nightly testimony meeting for men struggling with alcohol use disorder. And this mission proved so successful that it was replicated across New York and then across the country, and many cities still have their old rescue missions and still, attempt to play that same role for people, even as that religious model has sort of faded away in society. And the stories that came out of these missions had an even bigger impact than the institutions themselves. They were brief and they were dramatic. They were realistic in setting, because the urban slum was kind of one of the quintessential scenes of realistic American writing at the time. Yet they were miraculous in result. And the miracle was not just religious, it was social. They defied elite assumptions about alcoholism and poverty and ethnic identity, and they attacked the idea that was common in reform circles and in popular opinion, that there were deserving poor and undeserving poor. Some people were capable of change, they were trying their hardest, they were worthy of our help. Others were hopeless because they were making so many bad choices they didn't even deserve our help. The rescue mission recovery stories or conversion narratives made the case that everyone can change and everyone is worthy of help and therefore hope. And these were really simple stories, and they were described as incredibly powerful in their setting, but when they're taken out of that setting, it's almost, from this historical room, it's sort of hard to see. I'll give you an example. Jerry Macaulay's own story was often transcribed as this, and part of the reason was they had a strict 1-minute time limit on your testimony. So it was like no nonsense, like you had to get to the point. And because you might have 20 or 50 or 100 people who had to share that night. So Jerry used to say, "I was one of the worst drunkards in the 4th Ward, but Jesus came into my heart and he took it all out of me, and I don't want it anymore." And it was as simple as that. And it was cut and dried. But it was the miracle of who he was and who he represented, and the fact that this kind of language, this sort of somewhat rough working class language or street language, really sort of cut through a lot of elite expectations around religious vocabularies and sort of the more high-toned kind of establishment churches. So these stories got retold and reimagined in sermons, in social tracts, in novels, and even in psychological studies throughout the period. I found them in my research either in the center or in the background of the most influential works of the day. William James, Upton Sinclair, Jack London, Jane Addams, Mark Twain, and they were all over the progressive movement in both its religious and its secular forms. People really just saw them as a model of change that really defied a lot of the deterministic thinking of the day. But as they grew in influence, the stories were pressed into service to answer some of the biggest questions of the day, like, can immigrants in our cities be assimilated? They're coming from new countries, they have different religions, many of them haven't learned English, how can they possibly become Americans? And here was a model of dramatic change. Does religion have any claim on truth in an age of science? This was sort of the question that William James opened his famous work, Varieties of Religious Experience, with, and his main evidentiary base, it's sort of buried somewhat deeply in those lectures, were rescue mission recovery stories. And then, is social reform even possible if science is telling us that character is fixed and genetic? It's your ethnicity, or it's the shape of your head, or the shape of your jaw, or whatever the pseudoscience of the day said. The upshot is that these stories were appropriated for purposes that went far beyond what people with alcohol use disorder needed, or in many cases wanted. And this ideological conflict is in fact one of the historic reasons that Alcoholics Anonymous took the shape that it did in the 1930s. AA remains devoted to what it calls its primary purpose for that very reason, which, to sort of fuse it with Narcotics Anonymous, is to stay sober and to carry the message to the addict who still suffers. That's it. That's our whole purpose here. So these traditions in the 12-step movement kept ideological appropriation at a minimum. and sort of gave the movement a number of sort of decades in a way to sort of develop in intimate small groups these stories in these sort of safe spaces that were somewhat protected from appropriation or outside influence. Nevertheless, the 12-step movement did change our broad understanding of addiction and recovery. And it did so through the disease concept. It didn't really have a medical or scientific conception of disease, but it used that language, and it believed in that addiction and alcoholism were a disease through being allied with institutions like the National Council on Alcoholism, but also, I argue, through its narrative form. And it's a form that entered into memoir and fiction and film and television, often without the 12 steps or AA attached to it, for reasons that Michael touched on, that anonymity was an important tradition about AA membership. And as the modern recovery story became established and influential, it too did serve wider purposes for our culture. So recovery has become a touchstone for life writing in general. It's a model for how to describe a journey through breakdown into awakening and ultimately redemption and recovery. And in a society invested somewhat pathologically, many believe, in individual success, recovery is a cultural resource people use to make sense of the realities of life that involve failure and struggle and the need for second chances. And it's not a coincidence that this story type was developed during the Great Depression. AA was one of many ways that Americans gathered into clubs and small groups and communities for mutual support during this period, and in many cases produced new cultural forms out of that social activity. But at the same time, early AA was socially limited. It defined recovery as the restoration of middle-class white manhood, or what one chapter in the big book called the family trousers. The narrative proved flexible enough that many women and people of color adapted it to their needs from quite early on. But public recovery stories remained focused on restoring social status, and that left a lot of people out, and the literature exposed these tensions. So for much of the 20th century, stories about women's recovery, African American people's recovery, LGBT people's recovery went untold or unshared in the wider public sphere. Writers from marginalized identities tended instead to tell addiction stories that ended in dissolution or death, as if to make the point that there is no happy ending in a society that refuses to sanction your full personhood. And the recovery stories that do exist around those identities often found sobriety through radical movements or countercultures. For example, conversion to the Nation of Islam would often be a passage from drug use and drinking into sobriety and purpose. The fact is, a recovery story produces a recovered social identity, the voice of someone who was exiled from the world but is now at home again. As individuals, though, we don't get to define social identity by ourselves. It's social by definition. So dominant attitudes shape the stories that people feel allowed to tell, right, and can share widely. One example, if we are making life unbearable for trans youth, say, we're not only increasing their odds of addiction through the kinds of trauma that imposes, we're also refusing to sanction their stories of recovery because we're refusing to recognize the recovered person that they become. More broadly, what society, or in some cases the culture industry, often want from a recovery story is affirmation of the status quo. We want to feel compassion and understanding for how someone has changed, but we don't necessarily want to change ourselves, and we want to feel that somehow the goodness of that change came from who we are as a people. And that creates selection bias affecting which stories get told by journalists, which stories get made into films, and who gets awarded a publishing contract for their recovery. So turning to narrative in the opioid crisis, people are sharing their experiences all the time in all kinds of venues, from small meeting groups to big stages, from media stories to published books. But generally speaking, I think opioid recovery hasn't caught the public's imagination as a key narrative in the crisis. The language tends to remain one of despair and pain. And some of that has to do with the challenges of the crisis itself and the disorder itself, but some of it is driven by this historic need for recovery to affirm what we already believe rather than teaching us something new or changing us. So we want to show, for example, that the disorder can affect anyone. It's a disease, not a moral failing. And I have in my notes, almost word for word, the story Michael described of the honor roll student who's a high school athlete, maybe gets a hockey injury and is prescribed opioids. or the successful lawyer from a loving family. There are good faith reasons for these choices. People want those who are comfortable to feel that it affects people like them. But we should be asking, why did we need that person to be so perfect in order to unlock our compassion for them? And what does it communicate to someone whose disorder began with recreational use, or who came to their pain medication with a drinking problem, or because of a childhood trauma that carries its own stigma? We're basically, saying, like, you don't get to really tell that part of your story because you can't be sure that we'll then have compassion for you. And if we want to believe that people with the disorder are just like us, we have to ask what we mean by us. Innocence in our society is never innocent. It tends to come coded by race and class and gender. And so many stories get left out before they even begin. And then there are endings. We crave narrative closure as audiences, a feeling of the world restored and made whole again. But that desire comes into conflict with the realities of the disorder, realities like relapse, and the realities of effective treatment like medication. Our narrative expectations create barriers for people who want to share their story, and these barriers can impede recovery itself by making it harder for people to develop the story they want to live and tell. I think we all internalize a sense of what aspects of our life narratives are approved of and accepted by the wider public, and which are only for very small groups, and then which ones maybe we don't feel we can share with anyone. So we need to listen more openly if we want to be that supportive community for people entering into a journey of recovery. We need to hear people with opioid disorder speak on their own terms from where they are at and not where we imagine they ought to be. Personally, working for the city, I found that the Mayor's Office of Recovery Services is a really helpful resource in learning to do this. The staff there reframe the conversation from binary concepts like using versus sober to one that's informed by the clinical concept of the continuum of care, where everyone with the disorder is in the same community, is worthy of support, and has valuable experience to share. In addition, there are writing and arts groups doing innovative work in bringing private stories to more public settings. There's a group in Boston called Writers Without Margins, and they have a model where people can move from intimate writing workshops to more public stages like books and performances if they feel called. And these aren't necessarily recovery stories. They're literary writing workshops for people to express themselves. And at City Hall, there is a group developing an audio project where people who engage with services can share their experience without any expectations. And it's intentionally an audio project because the visual imagery of the disorder in particular is so easily turned to exploitative uses and meanings. So it's about allowing people's voice to convey their humanity. The imagery of people who are suffering from these disorders tend to trigger our sort of most, even when well-intentioned, our most sort of exploitative, I think, cultural impulses. My last point is that we can't simply purify ourselves of preconceptions when we listen to people share. We have a more active job to do than that. And a bit of Puritan self-scrutiny, I think, is called for. We should examine our own expectations and responses to experiencing with opioid disorder. Even when we have a positive response, we should try to be conscious of why we are being moved, what it's triggering in us. As audiences, we always help create meaning in the stories we hear. That's inescapable. So it's better that we have a sense of what's at stake for us beyond our own desire to be compassionate and to know ourselves as compassionate people. We should seek to understand how we are implicated in these stories, both in the reasons for the crisis and in what's needed to overcome it. And this was, in fact, a strength in the era of religious recovery. In its home spaces where people shared testimony, the drunkard's conversion, as it was called, was a democratic story. The good Christian visiting from uptown to witness miracles was expected and sometimes ordered to understand their own sinfulness as equal to that of the disheveled drunkard. They were enjoined to see the drunkard's soul as equally valuable in God's eyes as their own. Now, they suffered from an extreme form of binary thinking. You were either saved or unsaved. But at least to them, recovery was a story with really high stakes for them, and they were deeply invested in it. And it might not be bad for audiences today to feel similar stakes in degree, if not in kind. On the other hand, the 12-step movement protected those private narratives, so that people were less likely to have their stories exploited for other purposes, for religious purposes, what have you. But at the same time, when they reach the public, as I mentioned before, they were less likely to convey that process of social reconstruction that is so essential to how you develop your narrative. I talked earlier about the change in air quality that occurs when someone shares their experience. And I don't think we've fully defined that quality yet for the opioid crisis or filled that space with what the possibilities really are. Those who are surviving this disorder, wherever they are in their journey, have profound things to teach us about what we have in common, how we are connected to each other, and how we can move forward together. And I think we owe them and we owe ourselves a willingness not simply to approve of them and their change, but to be willing to be changed ourselves. Thank you.